Hi. Hi, everybody, both here in the auditorium and on the web. We are web streaming, so welcome if you are on the web, and welcome if you are here in person, even better. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fred Tauber. He is a professor from Boston University who ran the Boston University Center for History and Philosophy of Science for many years, and I have the pleasure of knowing him for many years as well. And knowing his important work on immunology and science studies and philosophy. I was going to say one thing about Fred. Fred is a very warm and nurturing academic. That may come through in the talk, it may not, but he has mentored many people and he has guided many people in this field. And so it's my real pleasure to introduce him today. He's now retired, but as you'll see from this talk, he's still incredibly active, including his most recent book published last year from Oxford Press. And so with no further ado, I will introduce Dr. Tauber.
Give me a hand, Peter.
Oh yeah, no, there's stairs over here.
That's all right.
Oh, I didn't need the hand. There you go.
All right. This work?
Well, there's a green light. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been too long since I've seen Peter, and I'm glad to meet all of his various colleagues and co-workers. You're doing interesting work. I'm going to speak. I offered Peter 2 talks, and he picked this one, so I'm only partially responsible. I've had an unusual career. I began as a academic physician doing biochemistry, hematology, oncology, and in my early 40s I transitioned into philosophy and history of science with an emphasis on immunology, looking at its development, its theory structure, and trying to understand how the science of selfhood developed. And this notion of identity, which is so crucial in terms of biology's understanding of organisms and function, has rested on this notion of the self. As you know, immunologists think that the discipline is about the discrimination of self and non-self, and I think that that is partially true, but it is only part of the story because, in fact, there is no such thing as the self. So if you have a paradigm built on self, non-self discrimination, and you cannot, in fact, define selfhood in an epistemological, in a firm fashion, that there's no object or entity of such, but it's a functional definition, then it opens up the notion of what it is to be an organism and what it means to be a self. A self in terms of being atomistic, insular, autonomous. And it turns out that if one looks at the philosophical background about personal identity and about selfhood in particular, there are different notions of what constitutes a self. The atomistic one, the one where we think of ourselves as autonomous and discrete, is one view of selfhood. But there is an entire philosophical tradition that understands each of us as being constituted by relationships. None of us can be identified independently of our affiliations, our relationships, our identifications more broadly. And in terms of immune theory, this is expressed in what I call the evolutionary ecological construct, where the relationship between the organism and its environment is determined not only by its ability to reject noxious and pathogenic substances, but its ability to assimilate, to tolerate, to allow the organism to interact with the environment in a constructive way. And indeed, none of us are completely isolated. So the question is, that's the general scientific orientation, this contrast of selfhood being a insulated atomistic construct or one based on relationships. And then the question is, well, if this is such a rich metaphor or model of biological identity, where does it come from in terms of the culture? Where does it come from in terms of its historical development? Where does it come from in terms of its philosophical underpinnings? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, because what I want to show you through this case study, as it were, is that the notion of the self in science, in immunology in particular, is drawn very heavily from the culture in which the science is being practiced. And our understanding of the self, drawn from our own self-identifications and our own self-understandings of who we are, has made its way into the science in a very interesting way. And reciprocally, the science is contributing to the cultural understanding of identity. So that's the general orientation. Now, Peter, I hope I know what I'm doing. No, that didn't work. Wait a minute.
Little director, you can advance. You can
This thing?
Yep.
Okay.
Advance. So maybe-
There we go. Okay. Crash Course in Philosophy of Science 101. Okay? So science studies is a discipline which really emerged in the 1970s. It's a conglomerate of philosophy, history, and social sciences, and it examines the theory and practice of science as an epistemology, how and what we know, and social practice. Okay, so it's the examination of science, both in terms of how it's practiced, its methodologies, and also how theories are constructed. So since the 1970s, the dominant theme has been to maintain that scientific knowledge is a construction, where many, sometimes obscure factors, social, political, economic, historical, linguistic, gender, contribute to the establishment of facts and their interpretation. Now, this is a radically different way of understanding science, at least as I was taught in elementary school and junior high, where the facts were the facts. You simply studied nature, the facts would be discovered, and the science was insulated from all these other elements of the social, political, economic infrastructure that supports the science and the thinking of the scientists who are doing the work. And the science studies community over the past 40 years has pretty much coalesced around the idea that this so-called standard rational view of scientific change and evolution has to take into account a much more complex infrastructure, conceptual infrastructure, to account for scientific knowledge. Now, during the 1990s, the so-called science wars were waged, where the defenders of science, as they understood it, in the standard model of just being a rational, logical progression of experimentation and the interpretation of empirical facts, was launched against the constructivists, the so-called science studies community that they claimed, the defenders, were relativizing thought, relativizing knowledge, relativizing truth. And they were arguing, the defenders of science, that if the walls of science were breached by these radical constructivists, the sanctity of science would be broken, and the entire edifice of Western civilization would collapse. And the rhetoric was highly heated, and people were calling each other the most nasty names, and it was very entertaining. Okay. The science wars have drawn to a certain resolution where people are not yelling at each other anymore. But in fact, the entire question of what is factual is already theory, was proposed by Goethe at the end of the 18th century. He wrote in a short essay, which I would suggest you might look at, The Experiment as Mediator Between Object and Subject. He wrote, "In the transition from empirical evidence to judgment, cognition to application, all the inner enemies of man lie in wait. Imagination, haste, self-satisfaction, rigidity, formalistic thought, prejudice, fickleness, this whole throng and its retinue. Here they lie in ambush and surprise not only the active observer, but also the contemplative one who appears safe from all passion." In other words, Goethe, was saying at the end of the 18th century that all interpretation is always lurking in the background, and there's bias whenever there's interpretation. Now, the bias may be objectified to a certain extent, but we can never be sure that our interpretations do not reflect some prejudice of one kind or another. The ur-text, the Bible, as it were, of the science studies community is Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was published first in 1962 and then reissued in a second edition in 1970. And Kuhn basically said the scientists work within a paradigm. And that paradigm offers opportunities for what he called normal science to progress, but there were underlying so-called metaphysical assumptions which guided the thought of the scientist. And he based his theory on a book which was published in 1935 by Ludwig Fleck, who was a microbiologist physician, who wrote a text entitled Genesis and Development of the Scientific Fact, where he demonstrated with the Wassermann test for syphilis. Does anyone know what the Wassermann test is anymore? Yes, we older fellows know. It was a test, a routine test for syphilis. In fact, at one point you couldn't get married without a Wassermann. We don't do that anymore, do we? Wassermann test? No. Okay, in any case, Fleck wrote the first extended treatise on this idea that scientific facts and the tests which we are based upon them, in this case the Wassermann test, how it developed and was contested depending on the interpretations given by differing scientists who had different underlying assumptions. A long time ago, I wrote a book called The Immune Self Theory or Metaphor in 1994, and the thesis was that immunology is ostensibly about biological identity, but how identity is understood borrows from various notions of personal identity. Very briefly, the book begins with showing the birth of immunology as a product of the discovery of infectious diseases, and this is crucial because it was the patient who was attacked by pathogens who was a self who had been violated. And thus there was a particular understanding of autonomous individuality that originally governed immune theory, which was entirely oriented towards defensive mechanisms. The whole notion of autoimmunity, physiologic or otherwise, the whole notion of tolerance was simply not understood or even recognized as part of the equation of immunity. And accordingly, the extrapolation of different views of identity into immune theory was a construction of a particular notion of identity which drew from philosophical and cultural sources. So immune or immunity comes from the Latin immunitas, which means freedom or exemption. It was originally about taxes and obligations. And this notion then evolved into our common understanding of defense. And the child, of course, is the exemplar being vaccinated. And in 1949, McFarland Burnett made the first introduction of the self into immune theory. Until then, the word never really appeared. It was understood, but it was not part of the vocabulary of immunology. And his theory was essentially based on the notion that there was a self, an immune self, characterized by immune tolerance and immune silence. And then this immune self was the borders, as it were, for immune reactivity. And if an antibody recognized an antigen, that antigen was by definition other, and thus slated for elimination. In this schema, the self was not recognized, for during development, all the lymphocyte clones, those antibody-producing cells, that recognized host elements were destroyed, leaving only cells with receptors capable of recognizing a foreign toxic substance. So in a sense, the self was a negative figure. And so it appeared in his theoretical writings, and the word basically didn't appear in the literature until the 1970s. Now, Tom Wolfe wrote that the 1970s was the decade of the self. And those of you who lived through it know what he was referring to. But in any case, if one looks at the literature, one sees this rapid exponential rise of the use of the word self in the literature, so that by 1990 it already was almost a vertical line, and it has continued for the past 30 years. Now, essentially, the argument I'm going to make is that immunity has three underlying propositions or presuppositions. That the immune system is protective, that it is protective of an autonomous thing, and that autonomous thing is an individual defined in terms of its individuality, whatever that means. And I simply want to alert you to the notion of the holobiome and the microbiome that we live with, and the borders of individuality are becoming more and more diffuse. But these are the three underlying notions of immunity, and they parallel social notions. The world is dangerous, individuals are invulnerable, and defense is natural. Now, this is a wonderful slide. It was taken a block away from where we live in Jerusalem when we're there. Here's a young man holding his son, and slung over his shoulder, he has an Uzi. It turns out that in our neighborhood, if I walk to the right one block, there's a memorial for two people who were stabbed and killed. And if I walk to the left, there's another memorial for another individual. And the neighborhood is by and large safe, but occasionally we see people packing a gun. And it's not Texas, it's Jerusalem. And whether or not immunologists have explicitly appropriated cultural notions of personal identity for their models of immunity, the idea of immunity has strong public appeal and has percolated into commonly shared Western ideas of selfhood. And we don't have to be in Israel to recognize that this notion of exclusion and protective defense is a very pervasive idea here in America. Here we have our president in a cartoon before his wall. I know I'm speaking in a red state. I don't really care. It's a fact that he thinks that we are endangered and that a wall will protect us. And here's a fine fellow down in Texas who has a sign that says, "Trespassers, please carry ID so we can notify next of kin." Ha, ha, ha. And the point of the slide is that this is a pervasive and common notion of what it is to be an individual in Israel or in America. We must be defended. It doesn't have to go into the political realm. It's in the medical realm as well. The HIV story is well known. When it first was recognized, it was identified culturally and among social critics as destroying the self. It destroys the immune system, but essentially it was anthropomorphized into destroying our very identities. And immunization characterizes, according to culture critics, capitalist societies by capturing the danger of contamination by the social other, the immigrant, lower classes, etc., and the corresponding need to protect the social integrity of the invaded group. This book by Esposito, Immunitas, is a very interesting excursion into this basic idea. And autoimmunity, which of course is a very well-established scientific notion in immunology, instantiates the self's own self-destruction, an internal psychological and social process that compromises the integrity of the person, that is, the sovereign integrity. But in that destruction, opportunities for transformation arise. And Derrida saw autoimmunity as a constructive thing, but he is drawing directly from immune theory to make the parallel. Now, Donna Haraway, another one of these culture critics, wrote in 1997, "The messy political does not go away because we think we are cleanly in the zone of the technical." That's a very pregnant statement. What she is saying is that just because we're talking science doesn't mean that the science is immune, excuse the pun, from its political meanings and its extrapolations. Feminist critics, of which she is one, regard the self-non-self basis of immune discrimination as a projection of social prejudice. Now, that's a radical extrapolation of the science into the cultural identifications, but there is some evidence that that, in fact, has some grounding. Insular individuality makes contested social boundaries a natural characteristic of social collectives. The warfare metaphors, which are used in immunology, attack, defense, invaders, dramatically illustrates this construction, both in terms of the self-non-self dichotomy, as well as the privileged standing of individuality over the commune. And what these people are saying is essentially that there is a bidirectional exchange of ideas between the science of immunity and the cultural way that we understand our social world, how we live as individuals, how our societies are understood as being defended or not defended, invaded, not invaded, et cetera, et cetera. The notion is that there's an exchange of rhetoric, but beneath the rhetoric, there's an exchange of ideology, an exchange of ideas. But the point that I made earlier, and what I now want to emphasize, is that the foreign is not necessarily threatening or dangerous. Immunology, in its defensive modality, provides a political metaphor of American culture, perhaps, only when it's understood as atomistically individual, divisive, and defensive. More provocative, this cultural bias has seeped into immune theory by valorizing individuality and celebrating personalized self-fulfillment at the expense of communal values. And in our discussion, we can explore what that means. I have some examples I would like to suggest to you, but I want to get through the talk first. There's an anthropologist by the name of David Napier who wrote a book called The Age of Immunology, which I would suggest you look at if you're at all interested in this topic. And he makes some claims which are provocative, but I think interesting. The basic schema of an I who must be defended against them is more than just metaphorical. The scientific conceptualization has been internalized into our collective social psyche. The dominant immunological model of individual insularity functions as a simple demonology made respectable by its appeal to science. The so-called age of immunology may thus be regarded as the power of a scientific paradigm about self and non-self that confirms and contributes to our culture at war with itself. Now, this was written 15 years ago. I think that his predictions, as it were, are very, very evident today in our political culture. Immunology, however, does not offer an alternative to this insular conception of identity. It does offer, and if a biological model is sought for a more benign relational society, let us probe more deeply. If one begins with the basic question, what is the organism? Current thinking disputes the very notion of individuality, certainly in its autonomous characterizations. And I've already talked about the holobiont and how the symbionts of which we live contribute to our very basis of living, and the individual as such does not exist, at least in a biological sense. A conceptual revolution is underway in which the atomistic version of biological identity is replaced with the notion of a consortium of species living together for mutual benefit, the holobiont. On this view, immunity is the process by which cooperative relationships are established and maintained, a very different conception from immunology's historical antecedents. Shifting the thought collective, and this refers back to Fleck, who basically argued that what Kuhn later called normal science is the thought collective. We all sort of herd together and work within a certain paradigm of thinking which organizes the way we do our science. And if the symbiotic organism is taken as part of this thought collective, then our notions of individuality and the organism itself changes. Although the biological individual has served as a crucial basis to study genetics, immunology, evolution, development, anatomy, and physiology, Each of these biological subdisciplines has a specific conception of an individual, which has historically provided conceptual context for integrating newly acquired data. However, during the past decade, nucleic acid analysis, especially genomic sequencing and high throughput RNA techniques, has challenged each of these disciplinary definitions by finding significant interactions of animals and plants with symbiotic microorganisms that disrupt the boundaries that heretofore had characterized the biological individual. In fact, the whole notion of what the unit of evolution is up in the air in terms of these considerations. Development doesn't occur without symbiotic relations. And the whole notion of physiology as being autonomous and insular has been completely disrupted. Animals cannot be considered individuals by anatomic or physiological criteria because the diversity of symbionts is both present and functional in completing metabolic pathways and serving other physiologic functions. Symbionts create an inner ecology, and immunity must both allow and maintain the balance of such cooperative relationships. The immune system functions to mediate the integration of beneficial microbes into the animal cell community and thus harmonizes, establishing balance through immune tolerance. Thus, an ecological point of view extends to the inner domain as well as to the external world. Symbiosis reconceives immunity from militaristic soldier to the organism's gatekeeper or passport control. When immunity is considered within the context of the organism's greater ecology, to include both internal and external universes, the borders must remain open to allow material exchange. On this understanding, the immune system identifies the deleterious, pathogens, allergens, toxins, but also, and just as importantly, allows the free exchange of a universe of substances and organisms to be engaged for the organism's benefit. So the point, I think, is illustrated here. Immunity is the dynamic process of a rejection and assimilation. You get over the wall, you go through the wall, and sometimes you don't get, you get excluded. But the point is, it is a differential dynamic process. So if one is challenging this notion of individuality, one is also challenging the defensive paradigm.
I gave a presentation on my research to the residents who we talked about, you know, what we're doing and trying to pick it out apart and stuff. And a full review was pretty interesting.
Oh, I don't know what to do. I'll just keep talking.
Hello. Whoever's online, who has their phone unmuted, please mute your phone.
Already. We were thinking about switching
Hello.
out one.
It's all right. Listen to me. Don't listen to them. Recognize.
There is no such thing as aspirating.
Is there not?
What?
Aspirating.
No good deed goes unpunished, right?
We are captive of our technology. What are we going to do?
I don't think they can hear me.
I'm muting you.
You're muting me?
I'm muting you.
How are you muting me? This is fun.
Good Lord.
Yeah, exactly. We have an open border.
Exactly. Okay. I think we've got quiet on the line.
Can you hear me still?
We can hear you.
Okay. All right, so recognizing the holobiont, the multicellular eukaryocyte, plus its colonies of persistent symbionts, conceptually challenges the ways in which the biological subdisciplines have heretofore characterized living entities. With such an ecological orientation, the collective becomes a biological unit in place of differentiation of the organism. Integration and coordination serve as organizing principles, and balance assumes a regulative principle. This notion of balance is extremely important in immune theory now. There are therapeutics being developed for infectious diseases, which instead of eradicating the microorganism, are putting the organism, the host and the pathogen in balance and minimizing damage accordingly. From this ecological vantage, the body's economy is regulated by a mixture of host and unrelated genomes, and thus the notion of a circumscribed insular entity designated the self fails as an operative construct. I think I've said this now 4 different times. Someone once told me you have to say it at least 3 times to get it through, especially if it's something which is not a comfortable idea. Immunity, ecologically conceived, must account for the organism as a consortium. Holobiont immunity requires both defensive and integrative functions. Immunity, so regarded, establishes a balance between these 2 engagements. An evolutionary equilibrium favors mutualistic rather than parasitic or unilaterally destructive interactions. Those are the 3 punchlines, and if you remember anything, that's what I'd like you to recall. So I wrote a book, it was published in 2017, called Immunity, the Evolution of an Idea, and it argues, and this is a bit ironic considering my own background as a clinician, that immunology is really an ecological science. An ecological perspective regards both internal and external environments, emphasizing the total array of interchanges between the organism and its environment, both benign and dangerous. In other words, the clinical perspective is too narrow for immunology. It simply omits too much of what's going on. When an ecological orientation is included, which assumes the subordination of the individual to a collective, that is a holobiont functioning as a consortium, in place of differentiation of the organism, integration and coordination serves as organizing principles. On this view, the immune system serves both to differentiate the self from the other, as well as to provide the gateway for cooperative relationships. In short, the immune system must allow for the ongoing negotiation of various interactions between the host and its environment, to remain restricted with an analysis that already assumes only a defensive posture, limits understanding how animals live in exchange with others. Accordingly, by describing that interactive economy, immunology becomes an important member of the ecological sciences. Okay, so now there's a question of why is it that the mechanisms of immune tolerance underlying mutualism is so poorly understood? Well, as Willie Sutton said when asked, why do you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. The same is true here. Turns out that clinical science controls the checkbook. And if you look at the NIH budget, you will see that funding for mechanisms related to immune tolerance represent perhaps 10% of the budget. And if you look at the textbooks of immunology, you will find a chapter, perhaps 2 out of 30, on tolerance. And you will find in general that the kinds of physiological autoimmunity, what we call the economy of the body, which is mediated by the immune system, or the establishment of the microbiome and the regulation of the holobiont, is almost ignored by current funding. I say almost because there is significant money, but in comparison to the old paradigm, very, very, very minimal. And if, in fact, we follow the argument that I'm making, that immunity, in fact, is a biphasic process where tolerance is just as important as defense, then we are missing an extraordinarily important component of what immunity is. Immunity, in fact, comprises a spectrum of responses, which, when viewed from the outside systems, appear as a discrimination of self and non-self based on certain criteria of reactivity. But it turns out that the full-blown effect of the immune response is very unusual. It occurs in the dramatic setting of a pathogen, but the ongoing business of the immune system is surveillance, and the scavenging of diseased and effete cells, cancerous cells, damaged cells. And reaction then means that something foreign has been identified because immunology has been so focused on activation beyond a certain threshold. Silence, on the other hand, denotes selfness. But selfness is actively identified. Tolerance is an active process. It's not simply ignorance or blindness. And within the immune system itself, and this is the crucial philosophical point, if there is one, is that the immune system itself, without this third-person perspective, only sees itself. Now, let that sink in for a moment. What does that mean? The immune system only sees itself. It doesn't see the other. It simply sees a reaction which constitutes what we see from the outside as the other. It's just part of the immune system's...
Do you think the alter itself is part of the equation?
I'll get to that. I'll get to that. But maybe this will help you in visualizing or conceptualizing the point. This is an epistemological fairy tale. Here is Goldilocks, and you have the three bears. And it turns out that Goldilocks, as you all recall, tasted the large bowl, which was too hot, and the small bowl, which was too cold, and she chooses the middle bowl, which is just right, and the beds and everything else. And so Goldilocks is like a scientist, choosing the boundary conditions for the study. If the immune parameters meet standards of activation, which are imposed from the outside, then the system follows the criteria we set for the study. In other words, the characterization is circular. What we want to study determines what is. In this case, the is of immune manipulation is the full-blown response to an antigen which satisfies the criteria of immunogenicity by the designed experimental protocol. Now, obviously, there are good reasons to establish boundary conditions in the clinical setting. We want to know how to protect our patient. But if we want to understand immunity, we need to understand the entire spectrum. We need to understand baseline. We need to understand the basic structure of the immune system as it is functioning in its resting state. And only then can we understand its regulation. And once we understand its basic regulation, can we then understand its regulation in its activated state? We understand it to a certain extent, but my entire point is that an entire spectrum of responses is ignored. The immune self is a construct of what the scientist projecting their own Cartesian view of agency, who indeed is reading the message. In the case of the immune functions, clearly the reader is the scientist. Immunologists like Goldilocks determine what is the right fit. The variable in the story is Goldilocks. She's the intruder, and she selects the right chair, the proper soup, the most comfortable bed. The setting simply provides her with the spectrum of choices, and as she moves from one scenario to the next, she decides what item best suits her needs. And that is basically the story about immune reactivity. The defensive identity and destroy scenario orients the observing immunologist. Because immunity has been examined in its most activated state, whatever fails to break the threshold of reactivity has traditionally been ignored. Simply, such activity is of little interest to the observer. But immunity ranges from a pre-immune state, whereby immune cells sense the presence of bacteria well before their formal encounter, to full-blown activation. Priming events signal the sensitive connections of an ecological state. Bacteria and the immune system, in which a web of molecular links communicate the presence of the other. And of course, thresholds have to be broken in order for the response to be recognized by the observing Goldilocks, the scientist. The spectrum of responses is too often neglected. Instead of the war against microbes, the fuller history of immunology is a tale of two personae, Adolf and Sally. Sally the squirrel does housekeeping. She's the ecological mediator. She allows you to drink your milk, eat your ice cream, eat your cheese, and allow the microbiome to be established. Sally is the one that's responsible for the turnover of red cells, turnover of everything, so to speak, and is the mediator of what is viable and what isn't, but certainly is not the alligator. Adolf is the predator in defense. He's sitting there waiting for the prey to come along. And we obviously need Adolf the alligator, but he is only part of the story. Adolf and Sally coexist, apparently independent and aloof from each other. Adolf personifies immunity as defense, and Sally enacts the autonomous activity of the immune system at rest. Notice I put it in quotations. Most immunologists ignore Sally. She's barely mentioned in standard immunology textbooks. Some have built a theory around her, and still others have attempted to account for both Sally and Adolf. And notice the years of this, 1974, 1991. These were sparks of insight which have not developed particularly well. These theorists concur that antigenicity is only a question of degree. Healthy host constituents are assessed and ignored. Damaged or senescent host elements evoke responses, ranging from varying degree of tolerance to active destruction. And number 3 of those regarded as foreign suffer full-blown assault and elimination. So, conclusion. I'm on time. That's great. From an ecological perspective, there can be no circumscribed, self-defined entity that is designated the self. I haven't gone into the science about that. There are at least half a dozen definitions of what might be the immune self. None of them have been adopted universally. It depends on the focus of research interest, which one is designated as useful and not useful. Rather, the organism adjusts to its own identity as it responds along a continuum of behaviors to adapt to the challenges it faces, and indeed, identity is determined by a particular context. Responses are consequently based not on intrinsic foreignness, but rather on how the immune system sees an alien or domestic antigen in the larger context of the body's economy. And the point here is that the so-called antigen is determined by its context. An antigen by itself is very rarely an antigen which evokes a big response. There usually are other factors that are at play which determine the fate of a particular substance. The perception of friend and foe is not determined by predetermined meanings, but rather by the context of the object's presentation. The discrimination of self and other have no formal or essential properties, and thus demarcations and self and other are fluid. As a result, intimate cooperation, alignments, individuality, each assumes an ambiguous standing, further obscuring the identity of an immune self. As observers, we impose the subject-object divide that distorts the biological reality of process-driven phenomena. Obviously, scientific categorizations facilitate investigations, but current efforts have failed to capture the full dynamics of the system at work. Accordingly, the context of the perceived object determines meaning, and when applied to the ecological or relational orientation to model immunity, the object distinguished as friend or foe depends on the context of the encounter. Current immune theory, with its present commitments to identity distinctions, is being revised as a useful construction, because understanding immune regulation and organization has assumed a complexity that cannot be simply divided between self and other. So a fully ecological perspective would reformulate the basic postulates of immune theory, which would then be built on an open architecture and thus fully represent the dynamic and dialectic relationship characterizing an organism engaged in its environment. Accordingly, as long as immunologists continue to exclusively peer through the lenses of the defensive paradigm, the understanding of immune function will remain closed and ironically incomplete. The notion of the self contextualized is this cubist painting. Can you see the figure within it? It's deliberately chosen because it pictorially demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about. Now, we have certain preconceived notions of what it is to be an individual, but Braque and Picasso said that these borders, these boundaries, as it were, are not nearly as well defined as we often would hope. And in this pictorial demonstration, they tried to capture this idea. So getting back to the exchange of culture and laboratory, to this constructive consideration, I'm listing here several factors, and I can defend each if you're interested, as to why the paradigm of the contextual ecological understanding of agency is becoming more and more interesting. First of all, we have an environmental crisis, if not a catastrophe. And as such, we are beginning to think ecologically. It's part of now of what we think about each morning when we get another report about the seas warming and the toxins which are being released. So there's a zeitgeist, a general sense that we are living in an ecological disaster zone, and we need to think about ourselves as agents within that ecology. We are in a globalized world, economically and socially. And so the notion of autonomous nations, and by extrapolation, autonomous individuals who are locked into a globalized world, is beginning to change our ideas of insularity about our own identities. We are beginning to naturalize personal identity. We are looking at complex behaviors, to genes and molecular transmitters. And the notion that personal identity is simply a social idea is being challenged by the fact that we are becoming more and more biological in our understanding, and that biology is beginning to support notions drawn from science about symbiosis, about the microbiome, about the holobiont, et cetera, et cetera. And as we're beginning to understand our own bodies, naturalized, as being integral to our own notions of ourself, this is having an important effect. Scientism supporting certain ideological positions over others. That's an entire category that maybe in the discussion we can touch on. But if you look over here at the postmodernism, the notion of the self being decentered, disenfranchised, left untethered, that also has, I think, some supportive capital for this notion of the atomistic self being challenged. And there are other notions which are more complex and which I don't have time to discuss. So in conclusion, I would argue that the notion of the immune self mirrors a much larger drama of which we're all part of. Just as the immune self rests between two competing formulations of autonomous versus relational, so too are Western societies similarly balancing different conceptions of the citizen in terms of individual and communal identities. The implications of the greater contest between modernist and postmodernist conceptions of the subject reflect a moral deliberation which beyond the epistemological debate. Traditional notions of immune identity have resisted displacement, so too have modernist notions of individuality remained anchored in the Western psyche. And finally, the freedom associated with liberal precepts of individuality is not readily mortgaged, much less forsaken. Indeed, despite efforts of the most influential 20th century philosophers to revamp the modernist conception of mind and personal identity that accompanies those descriptions, the basic appeal of human autonomy, dominant during the modern period, is not easily dislodged. And so everything I've told you today is probably going to be ignored for some time in the future. Thank you.
I'll let you field your questions, but
So very nice. I'm an immunologist, and that's why I came to this.
Oh, good.
Talk.
Great.
This is, I mean, I think immunotolerance is really getting the attention. More people study like T regulatory cells. You know, a lot of the immune disease is actually caused by the loss of that tolerant function. So it is getting there. I'm just curious about why you started to study this. Is it because you feel like immunology is so complicated, uh, and why you kind of put some philosophy into the immunology study, and I kind of agree that I think I remember that book as Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. The author emphasized that a person start from dependent and then to independent and to interdependent. So that resonate with your commune value. So I really like your talk, and I think I'll read your book. But I'm just curious why you started to study this. Thank
Okay.
you.
That's a very fair question, because I'll give you 3 anecdotes, okay? When I was beginning to study phagocytes, which was my expertise, I had an interview with Niels Jerne. For those of you who don't know, Niels Jerne won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1985. He was the preeminent theorist of immunology through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I went there and had an interview with him because I was thinking of joining the Basel Institute of Immunology to do science. And he said, well, what are you working on? And I said, well, I'm working on phagocytes. And he looked at me, he said, well, that's not immunology. That's not immunology. And immunology was lymphocytes. That's all it was. Okay, so that's 1978 or so. 10 years later, 1988, I'm the editor of the subsection of phagocytes in the Journal of Immunology. And the editor-in-chief, he calls me up, he says, Fred, we're thinking of getting rid of this section. We don't think that phagocytes are part of immunology. This is 1988. And I said, well, that's ridiculous, da, 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 da. And fortunately, the section remained. But here was the second blow to my identification as an immunologist. And so by 1995 or thereabouts, I decided that, in fact, they were right. I wasn't an immunologist. I didn't know enough about lymphocyte biology and all the rest of it. And so for me, it became a challenge to understand what they were talking about in terms of immunology, because I always thought that that's what I was doing. So that's when I got interested in the origins of immunology and how it was constructed, and its development, and its ongoing theory development. And so as an outsider, I was doing this work. And it was as an outsider that I've engaged the immunological community. I suspect they consider me a gadfly. There are very few people who are working in this area. But that's fine, because I wrote the first books in philosophy of immunology as a subgroup of philosophy of biology, which was an extraordinary opportunity to actually frame a discussion, a discipline, without any precedent. So I brought to it what I had, and this is where I am now. I began as a clinician doing phagocyte biochemistry, and I ended up as an environmental scientist arguing that immunology is being distorted. And that's the story, with a few details omitted. I mean, this is 30 years of work.
I am not an immunologist, and so I apologize for a naive question, but if you look back to the very origins of the immune system, what do you find? If the original self is a single cell and it's defending itself against something noxious in its environment, or alternatively, if it's looking for something that will benefit it, then will that help you sort some of these issues out?
It turns out that the phylogeny of the immune system is very poorly studied. We know very, very little. We know that lymphocytes and antibodies essentially begin with the vertebrates. So with the vertebrates. Okay, so before vertebrates, there is no lymphocyte, there's no immunology, all right, according to Jerne and others. And so there's what's called natural immunity. And phagocytes are very crucial in that phylogeny. And that is one of the primary defense mechanisms. And you're right, amoebae have defenses. They allow some things in and they keep some things out. So immunity is there from the beginning.
I want to ask about ecosystems.
Sure.
So a lot of ecological scientists will say, like, if an invasive species comes into an ecosystem, we have to look at whether it's getting back to equilibrium or if its equilibrium is disrupted. And I was trying to think if that would apply back to this idea of immunology, if immunology then should be aiming at getting an organism back to equilibrium, or if instead it should be like getting an organism back to health, which is what I'm guessing. It sounds like maybe you would disagree with the idea that immunology is getting back to health because it's got to be...
TJ, that's a great question, okay? 19th century, Claude Bernard said essentially that the organism was a stable entity, and by homeostasis, it maintains its stability. The first immunologist, the man whom I studied to begin my own investigations, was a man named Mechnikov, Elie Mechnikov, a Russian embryologist. And he argued for the balance thesis. He said that essentially the organism was constantly in disharmony, and that the immune system was responsible for mediating its harmonization. And that harmony could change, right? So it was a dynamic notion of identity. And this idea was crushed by the immunochemists who followed Bernard and simply argued that the organism was essentially stable, and any infraction of that stability had to be countered by destruction of the infraction. So it was two competing ideas of what an organism is and how it's regulated. And obviously, I've assumed the Mechnikovian position that balance is the governing precept. Thank you.
Didn't Mechnikov also propose an actual reparative
He did.
function as a part of that?
Yes.
So in many ways, some of the first stem cell biology concepts can go back to some of the work that he was mentioning in terms of immunology, because he saw it both as, responding to something, making choices about things, some of which led to things being eliminated, some of which led to other cells replacing it and augmenting function. So his views, I believe, were way ahead of their time in terms of predicting both immunity and stem cell biology and regenerative medicine.
I'd like to amplify your comments. Thank you very much. I began my own study with Mechnikov. I wrote a book called Mechnikov and the Origins of Immunology. It's Oxford 1991. That's how old it is. And that's how I began my study of immune theory. And he was so at odds with the dominant paradigm that he was basically the enfant terrible of that period. He did, however, share the Nobel Prize with an immunochemist, Ehrlich, in 1908. And so I looked at the Nobel archives of that discussion. Very interesting stuff. And it was highly political because the Germans were the immunochemists, and Mechnikov was called a cellularist, and he worked at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And in the 1880s, there was great rivalry between the French and the Germans, and it became a nationalistic argument, among other things. Not that it wasn't complicated enough. But Mechnikov truly was a prophet for a much more complex biological understanding of immunity. I just want to make the comment, the anecdote, that he introduced yogurt to France because he thought that there was deleterious bacteria that should be replaced with lactobacilli. And the lactobacilli would replace the toxin-producing bacteria, and people would live a long time. He made the observation of the Caucasians living a long time, and because, quote, they ate a lot of yogurt. And so there was a Metchnikoff yogurt in Paris, but he did not take a franc for it. He wasn't paid a dime or a franc. And he was an incredible character. I'm surprised that you know so much about him.
We have two more questions. I'm going to allow them. If people have to leave because it's 1 o'clock, that's okay, but I'm going to allow the two questions. So go ahead, Zach. And
I would like to ask a historical perspective. I was trained at the Pasteur Institute, and obviously Metchnikoff, the school of Metchnikoff and the ones from the Germans, they were they were not always very friendly, as you remember.
Yes.
The question I was going to ask you is two. One, how do you consider altered self?
In what sense?
In immunology.
Well, are we talking in terms of cancer? Are we talking about damage? Are we talking about defeat? The immune system is responsible for maintaining the harmony as best it can. So altered self may be tolerated or it may not be. If it hurts function, then the immune system is alerted to eliminate it. We know this very simply from red cells, right? Red cells live 120 days and they're destroyed the spleen. And we know that the antigens or I should say the proteins and lipoproteins on the surface get oxidized and they then become changed and they're recognized as something else.
I come from I'm going to give you my perspective first.
Okay.
Which is I'm an oncology nurse, and I also studied political theory. And so I know as an oncology nurse, when you talk to cancer survivors and as a nurse, we are never trying to get the patient back to where they were. We are always trying to make them be able to manage in where they are within that context, right? And so I think about that in terms of immunology, that there's not really a getting back to where you are. There's only a managing where you are. And I think about that in terms of also a liberal versus a conservative perspective, right? That the conservative wants to keep things as they are, and liberals have a more fluid approach to the world. And I think it's a fascinating idea when you think about that, about the immunological self and the philosophy behind that.
And?
Oh, I just wanted to comment on that. It's interesting. Like I would argue that immunology is probably much more the idea that we are trying to maintain that balance in a world where the borders are much more fluid.
Yeah, but you're probably a liberal.
That's exactly it.
And what I'm trying to say, and you know as well as I, there's a very different view of what it is to be an agent.
Indeed.
And how dangerous the world is.
So are you agreeing with this, the science scholars who say there's a lot of politics here? So are there facts left?
Yeah, look, the whole point of the talk is to emphasize this bidirectional exchange of ideas and concepts. And you can project your own ideological orientation onto the science and get a very different view of what's going on. And immunology is the most intimate of our science, biological sciences. It's the one that we maybe the neurosciences because of the mind. But in terms of identifying who we are, that's what the immune system is supposedly doing. And how you do that identification is the issue. Pleasure.